The question always arises, why are we only spending 2% of our GDP on defense? We should spend much more, upwards of 4, as Rajiv Gandhi did in a couple of his last 2 of his 5-year period. In fact, that was the highest percentage of the GDP that Indian defense allocations had, 4.21, I think in 1987, 88 or 88, 89, one of those years. That's the headline argument. But you go under the headlines and lift the layers as we try to do. Look at this 4.3 lakh crore spending. As I said, out of this, pensions is 1,12,000 crores. Now, next element here, salaries. Now, if you look at the salaries just of the Army, Navy, Air Force, uniformed forces, it is 1,08,000 crores. What does it tell you? It tells us that today your pension bill has already become higher than your salary bill. Then you see, and then there is another 25,000 crores of salaries which goes towards civilian employees of the 3 armed forces. Each one has many civilians, and also Defense Research and Development Organization, that's another 25,000 crores. So then salaries become 1,33,000 crores, but uniformed forces, soldiers get paid 1,08,000 crores, retired soldiers get paid 1,12,000 crores, and you still have dissatisfaction in both the communities, especially the veterans, who demand more also by way of pensions and other benefits. Then if you look at the headline figure that matters, that is the capital budget. That is the money you require to buy new equipment, to modernize, etc. That's only 1,08,000 crores. So you 1,08,248 crores, your salary bill is 1,08,461 crores, and once again your pension bill is 1,12,000 crores. So highest is pensions, second highest is salaries, third highest is for your modernization and capital acquisition. In fact, if you add all expenditure on ongoing basis, or what might be called fixed expenditure in the corporate world, that is salaries, administrative costs, stores, replacements on the normal basis, not acquisitions and modernization, that itself is more than 2 lakh crores, 2,04,000 or something crores like that. So this just tells you that you have a lot of money, but it is not buying you much firepower. It's buying you a very large manpower. It's also providing sustenance, relief and gratitude, nation's gratitude to a lot of retired people, but it is not giving anybody much firepower because there is very little money left. Now, this debate has been going on for a long time, and I must confess there must have been times that I also took the same position, that India needs to spend more of its GDP on defense. Why I might have said so? Because one, I'm a defense buff and loyalist of the armed forces, so instinctively you think armed forces should get more. Second, we journalists don't particularly understand economics or basic budgeting unless somebody teaches us. So since I've been taught this, and it takes time and you need experience, you have to understand the difference between GDP and the budget. The GDP does not belong to the state. It does not belong to the government. So government, what is spent as a percentage of the GDP is a notional figure, because GDP is my income, your income, the income of the Uber driver who you pay for your ride, income of the panwala outside your workplace. It's the income of every farmer in the country. GDP belongs to the entire citizenry, 1.36 billion people. It does not belong to the state. What belongs to the state is the taxation that the state collects on this GDP. Now, on that taxation and the money that the government borrows is the government's budget based. So the key thing to look at is not the GDP, it's the budget. If you look at India's budget now, central government's budget. Defense actually gets 15.5% of India's budget. It is the highest single head for any expense in the national budget. The only thing higher than this is something that's really spread all over, that is the interest payment. So interest payment is almost 1.5 times our defense budget, so maybe 22-23% of our budget, not GDP. Defense budget is the largest item, defense expenditure in our national budget. So see, if defense is 15.5% and about 2% of the GDP, think about some of the others. If you look at all the subsidies that central government pays all of India's citizens, all subsidies, they amount to 10.8% of the national budget. So defense budget is already 1.5 times more than all the subsidies that everybody complains about, that you are giving away freebies, and these subsidies really go to the poor. If you just look at food subsidy, it's 6.6% of the national budget. It's less than half, in fact, just about 40% of your defense budget. Rural development is about a fourth of your defense budget, a little less than fourth, at 4.3% of the national budget. Then you come to health, it's 2.4% of the national budget, 0.3% of your GDP. So in fact, if you add health and education, which is 3.4% of the budget and 0.4% of GDP, so health, education, food, rural development, and throw in the subsidies. As a percentage of GDP, you are spending the equal of all this on defense. So you have to be realistic about how you can spend more money on defense. Of course, you should spend more money on defense, but where will that money come from? And from which mouth will you take that money then to move it here? Because you just can't print money. That's not going to happen. Now, as I said earlier, what does this money buy you? This money has bought you armed forces. Don't misunderstand the expression bought. Government spends and raises its armies, armed forces, which are about 1.3 million people. Remember, there are also paramilitary forces, that is CRP, ITBP, BSF, etc., NSG, all of them. They've also now crossed the 1 million mark. So just as you spend 2% on India's defense forces, you also spent about 0.5% of India's GDP on India's central armed police forces. That's another 77,000-80,000 crore rupees annually. So, so you get between the two of them almost 2.5 million people in uniform under the central government, and then all the states have their police forces and armed police forces, etc. This at a time when almost every major military power in the world is reducing its manpower. So one of the initiatives that this government has taken, which I think is a good initiative, is to rationalize manpower. A lot of the waste of manpower has been curbed in the past. Some really wasteful, or I would say completely obsolete areas like military farms have been dismantled, because armed forces tend to swallow manpower because they have large establishments, and manpower just disappears there. And that's when the larger debate on teeth to tail ratios comes in, because manpower costs money. So if you ask me, I think India's armed forces have a major HR challenge, human resources challenge. This has to be addressed. It will not be addressed in 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, or in the term of one government. But the process of rationalization has to begin at some time, because size itself doesn't buy you anything. Size, in fact, can become a liability. Now, I will mention a couple of highlight points here. One, in spite of having such large armed forces, and in spite of spending more on defense and health, education, food subsidies, and many other subsidies put together, and I'm saying education, health, rural development, not subsidies, total spending, plus food subsidy. In spite of that, do we have the decisive punch when it is needed, at least against our weaker adversary? Because India has two situations. One, against China, India needs deterrence from the Chinese making military gains against us at any point of time. Against Pakistanis, we need deterrence so that the Pakistanis are deterred even from using unconventional methods to bleed us, to bleed India, with the presumption that short of going to a full-fledged war, India can do nothing and a full-fledged war will not happen. Balakot and the air skirmish the day after Balakot showed us that we do not have that punch. Because if we had had that punch, then the aircraft that went to Balakot would not have been 30-plus-year-old Mirages. They would have been newer aircraft. Also, the trouble they had in launching one set of their weapons probably would not have taken place. Second, they would not even have had to go that deep inside Pakistani controlled territory, Pakistani airspace. They could have been on your own side or just make a shallow incursion and then carry out the attack. The next day, think about it. Pakistan has 1/7 of your budget, Pakistan Air Force. Pakistan economy is now almost a tenth of your size. Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves, they've gone up a little bit compared to about 2 months back, are still just about 3% of your foreign exchange reserves. Just about 3%, right? At the last count I saw $14 billion. And that after they've collected some money from here and there. I think Qataris have given some and somebody else has given some, and they have a voluntary disclosure scheme. Yet, on that morning, they were able to field better missiles than India. They were able to field some aircraft that were better than anything that the Indian Air Force has. They were able to exercise better control from their airborne control systems aircraft in the back than India could. They definitely had better communication, so they were able to jam IAF's communication, at least that of some of its aircraft. And remember, they were also able to outnumber the IAF that day, not by 8 to 9 or 10 to 9, but by almost 4 to 1. Now, this tells you that somewhere along the line, in trying to build size, we have forgotten some basic principles how to build more effective defense and deterrent. And there are reasons for that. One reason for that is that our strategic establishment has been very tactical in its thinking because India has a history of actual wars. Now, most of these wars took place in the 60s, 62, 65, 71. So, a lot of us are children of the decade of war. I went to school during the decade of war. So, these are scars on our minds. And many of the others have then seen low intensity conflict. So, we carry scars from a decade of full-fledged wars into the new pricks from the 3 decades of low intensity conflict. And sometimes we end up applying the logic of full-scale warfare to an environment of low intensity conflict. We have to revisit some of those presumptions. Must India always prepare for a two-front war? Do we really imagine China and Pakistan combining and their armies coming rolling down our borders, trying to destroy India? If that is the case, why did India invest so much in a triad of nuclear deterrence? And also, at a defensive level, India can handle them. But important thing is, where is your diplomacy and where is your strategic planning? Today, instead of planning for the fantasy of a two-front war, which will never happen, instead of planning for that, which will almost never happen, there has to be some likelihood for something to happen. It should be demanded of India's diplomacy and India's strategic planning to make sure that India does not face a two-front war. because a two-front war is unaffordable. Even if you double the size of your defense budget, which means if you then began to spend on defense, right now on defense, you spend 3.5 times more than on rural development, right? Suppose you started spending 10 times more on defense than on your rural development, even then you will not have the wherewithal for a full-fledged two-front war. That's a reality that the Indian strategic establishment has to accept. I do also think that the higher levels in this establishment, in this government, they accept it. Nobody wants to say it because it's not a very popular thing. Now, this is not something that's been realized only now. This is something that's been realized globally also by the big military powers. And one thing that I think is read in every military academy anywhere in the world, and definitely in India, is this book that was written in 2007 by General Rupert Smith, European general, called The Utility of Force, The Art of War in the Modern World. And the first line in the book is, war no longer exists. And then he goes on to say, I'm not saying that there will not be conflict or there will not be utility for militaries. But he says the kind of wars we've had since the years of Napoleon, which is industrial scale, large wars, two large armies, cavalries, maneuvering against each other, and now lately with air power, etc., that will not happen anymore. Industrial scale war will not happen anymore. And the example he gives is, very early in the book, is that last tank engagement of any size in the history of mankind was in the Yom Kippur War in the Sinai Desert between the Israelis and the Egyptians. And when was that? 1973, when most of you were not even born yet. I was 16 then, that far back. And yet, since then, armies around the world have bought tens of thousands, I think by my estimate, about 150,000 main battle tanks. What will you use them for? In tomorrow's warfare, main battle tanks will be used for target practice because there will be Apaches and the rest or equivalents up there firing missiles from a distance. So you have to now tailor your armed forces in terms of what utility you are going to have. And I will quote again from him. He says, I'm not saying that there will be no use for military powers, but you have to redevelop your military power in such a way and tactics, and you have to adapt them to each conflict or lose the ability to protect ourselves and our way of life. So the threat to ourselves and our way of life today is not 3,000 Pakistani tanks marching into the Thar desert. The deterrence over Pakistan is not 3,000 Indian tanks marching into the Thar desert into Pakistan, because you know those things are unsustainable. Deterrence today is that next time something like Balakot has to happen, you can do it completely in a risk-free manner with much greater surety of what outcomes you will have, and with a much greater surety for the adversary for the outcomes they were going to have. For example, if the Pakistanis knew that if they send 26 aircraft to challenge India along any part of our airspace, between the combination of much better missiles and much better aircraft and much better radars and much better communication, they will end up using 5 or 6 of those. They would never even come to challenge you. With 7 times Pakistan's budget, you should be able to do it. And if you can't do it with 7 times Pakistan's budget, I can promise you, you will not do it even with 10 times Pakistan's budget. Because this is not to do with money. This has to do with strategic planning and prioritizing. So that is my larger view on the defense budget debate. I know this will come up and I know that many will agree, but many more will disagree. So please write, I will respond. And many of you will say, why can't India spend more? Because we may be spending about 16% or 15.5 or 6% of our budget on defense. Pakistan spends maybe 30%. But remember, there is one essential difference between India and Pakistan. Pakistan is a national security state. India is not a national security state. India has insecurities and threats. But the main impulse of the Indian state is not national security. Desh ko khatra hai, or that we need our armed forces to protect the ideology of India. India is not an ideological state. Pakistan is an ideological state. Israel is an ideological state. India is not an ideological state. India draws its strength from its constitution. India needs its armed forces to protect its boundaries, its constitution, and its values. So, what is a national security state? There may be many definitions, but I will tell you the most succinct one, which was once spoken by a former Pakistani army chief, a very good army chief, so good and so professional that he could not last his full term. He was fired because he was much too professional for the Pakistani system, General Jahangir Karamat. So he said in a lecture that a national security state is one where national security becomes the first and the foremost priority of a state, and whereby then armed forces or the security establishment gets the first right or priority over all national resources. And he also goes on to say that, see, we Pakistanis accepted that idea, and look at where Pakistan has ended up. It's ended up in a situation where its economy, its per capita income is now getting lower than Bangladesh's. The gap is increasing every year, where its growth rate is half of India's, population growth rate is twice as much as India's, so GDP gap is, per capita GDP gap is increasing even faster, and where its foreign exchange reserves are 3% of India's foreign exchange reserves. And remember, it has gone to borrow, it has signed all kinds of conditionalities just to borrow $6 billion from IMF. And as I had said earlier once, I will repeat that, that is less money than ArcelorMittal is paying to buy out the bankrupt SR Steel in our NCLT process. So that's what happens when you set yourself up as a national security state, because that concept is not military, that concept is political, and a republic like ours has gone way beyond that. So once again, do your strategic planning that fits into your spending ability. Of course, push comes to the shove, money will be found. There is, however, still a lot of irrationality in the way our government functions. For example, one of the very interesting things this time in the budget is that defense forces have got one tax break, one concession, that the equipment they import from overseas, on that they will have to pay no customs duty. Now, I don't understand how do these things work. If armed forces are being funded from the state budget, why are they having to pay customs duties? In fact, they pay GST also. For every tank that the Indian Army buys, there is GST paid to Government of India. But customs duty, that has now been waived. And my colleague, Snehesh Alex Philip, reminds me that in 2016, there was a minor scandal when customs has actually detained a consignment of spare parts for Mirage aircraft that were coming in, because customs duty wasn't paid. Only in this country can such a thing happen. And that reminds me of something that my favorite humorist, but serious humorist, P.J. O'Rourke once wrote when he came traveling to India. His style is to travel through countries and write about them funnily but interestingly. And he said he was here when India carried out Pokhran 2. And then he said, hang on, do we Americans have to worry about Indian missiles coming and hitting us? And he said, after a while, I thought through, and I figured that we Americans have nothing to worry about it, because before an Indian missile is launched on America, 100 customs officers will strip it and examine each one of its parts for exportability. You might have laughed at that, but when you hear stories like this, your customs blocking a consignment of Mirage spares because their duty wasn't paid, then you know this happens only in India. So many anomalies have to be removed, but these are anomalies which are irritants, which can be jokes, but they are not central to India's defense problems.